Concept of this session is a bit of a conversation between John and Lara that we're going to listen in on a bit. This is the only session that had a reading assignment, if you wanted to call it that. So we all have a shared basis for talking about things, which is a lot of John's wisdom rolled up into a normative piece about the way the world should come. But the concept to start was that John and Lara would start talking and ask each other some questions, and hopefully you all have questions that will come up as well.
Yeah. Those of you who know me know that I never say anything without a handout. So since we're doing this on Zoom, I had to send you an e-handout.
Yeah, and I will also say that I've learned through this process yet again that John doesn't really need a helping hand. So I'm going to get out of the way a bit right now and let John and Lara start the conversation.
Okay.
And John, one thing we didn't decide was who was going to go first. So
why don't I ask you a question first, Lara?
Okay, take it away.
Just to get the ball rolling.
Sounds good.
I want to ask you something that's a little bit personal about you and your career. When you were a graduate student, trudging up the mountains in Colorado to do your field research and yeah. Oh, okay. You said to me on several occasions, having watched me live my life, you said, there's no way I'm going to be a professor. I don't want the stress and the burden of having an academic career and all the pressures that come with this. And now, 20 years later, 15 years later, whatever it is, you are a professor. So why the change of mind?
Yeah, it's funny, John. I think you reminded me of that comment about, well, when I was in starting as a professor, I think you reminded me of it roughly annually and probably about every 5 years since. And I mean, you're right. That was my attitude when I started graduate school. And I think it wasn't just watching you and all of the, the good work that you were doing, but also sort of just seeing what faculty took on in general. It just
what was the bad stuff that you about my life that you wanted to avoid?
I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was a sense of insecurity or if it was more about wanting to actually have an impact and feeling like academia was a step removed. It was sort of maybe a mix of all of those things. And I think I just wasn't sure that it was the right path. And I had become interested in research and I had some interest in teaching as well, but I just didn't see whether, I couldn't tell whether it would be fulfilling and whether the sort of burden of what felt like pressure at the time would be worth, would give me the payoff, that I was seeking.
So irrelevant. I'll buy irrelevant. I'll accept irrelevant.
You'll accept
more than I would have if you said, I don't want to see myself being driven psychotic by the pressures.
Well, especially since I feel like I'm being driven psychotic by the pressures on a daily basis now, but yeah. I don't know what changed. I think part of it was I felt like I could see a path to having some impact, and I also enjoyed interacting with students more than I anticipated.
Yeah,
I think that's part of it. Is I got a lot of energy from being around students and feeling like that was an avenue for impact that I hadn't anticipated.
Do you get a buzz out of teaching 102?
I don't know if I describe it as a buzz, especially not now when I have to record the lectures ahead of time and I don't actually get to see the students when I'm lecturing. I think I enjoy the one-on-one mentoring a lot. I really enjoy just the helping students figure out what direction they want to take and where they have some motivation and passion and curiosity, and I think I get a buzz out of that.
Yeah. Good. Would you say that 102 does it need to change in response to the changing times, or have you found that the old curriculum, which Holdren and I really developed in the 70s, still works for you and for the students.
Yeah, well, not everybody who's on this may realize that I am now teaching 102. This is my, what is it? 18, 19, 20. I guess this is my 4th year.
Yeah.
Is that right? Teaching 102. And boy, was that not an easy, it wasn't easy to take that course on. And there's just so much packed into it. There's a lot of content to master and a lot of tools that it really just kind of delivers in rapid fire for students. And, you know, when I started, I thought, okay, I'm going to have to think about how to, you know, make this course relevant to 2020s, you know. And actually, I told John, and I tell my students this, I've told my students this twice now. One of the lectures that I was planning to drop was the one on infectious disease models. I was thinking, it's just one lecture, you know, maybe that's not appropriate for this global environmental problems class, and maybe we could just drop that and create a little space for, you know, more on ecology or more on, you know, some other topic. And then I hadn't gotten around to doing it yet, and then wham, last year. Oh my God. So now, I mean, there's no way I can drop the infectious disease model now. It's, you know, and yeah, and especially the probabilities of, you know, how you calculate the probability of actually having COVID once you know the false positive and the false negative rate in your test. So yeah, that course has a lot of material that just it kind of comes around. You think it's irrelevant, and then, you know, some little bit of it is irrelevant now. Mm-hmm. And then it comes back around, you know. People weren't paying so much attention to toxics in the era of climate change. But then you listen to Arlene Blum give a talk about these perfluoroalkyl substances that are now, you know, prevalent everywhere, including in our outdoor, you know, equipment. We buy all of our Gore-Tex gear to keep ourselves, you know, dry. And they're just all going off into the rainwater and contaminating groundwater, Teflon, you know. Mm-hmm. So these issues they just haven't gone away.
Yep.
So
the most recent new toxic addition to the environment are COVID masks. There's a huge problem with discarded masks. Birds get entangled in the little loops that you use to attach them. And it's something we never would have thought of 2 years ago.
Yeah, so I'm really interested to hear if all of the illustrious ERG alums on this call have opinions about what should or shouldn't be in 102, because I am thinking about, you know, well, are there ways in which it should evolve in terms of new kind of foundational tools that should be a part of the course, or content areas, because it tries to do both. It tries to do so many things, you know, both introduce content areas and introduce tools. And so if you've got brilliant ideas, just send them my way now or on email anytime. Because it does seem like it should be a living class, but I've been surprised at how enduring a lot of the topics are, actually. So thanks, John, for creating that course.
We can open it up to questions or whatever you guys.
Well, maybe I can I ask you a question? Well, Chad, go ahead.
I was going to say, you haven't gotten to ask a question yet. John asked one and then it continued to kind of grow. So, but I will say just quickly, Lara, since everyone else is muted, of course, 102 should evolve. And of course, you should put your spin on it. Eventually, it will be known as your course. Yeah, exactly. In my hometown, you never lived in the house that bore your name. It always bore the name of the family who lived in it before you did. So eventually you'll hand the course off, and then that's when it will really be yours. Yeah. In the meantime, you get to tinker. Okay, please ask your question of John.
Yeah, well, I was in reflecting a little bit on the piece that you sent around, and then also thinking about how much in your career you sort of pivoted really hard into ecology, I would say. And I'm actually kind of curious whether you would have anticipated that back as you were starting at ERG, that you would sort of go so deep into theoretical ecology. So if you want to comment on that, I'd be interested to hear that. But I was also interested in how that sort of immersion in ecological approaches and ecological thinking has affected your own perspective on, how we should go about living our lives or how we should shape our public policies.
Yeah, let me start with this second part of that question. What's so useful about ecology more generally outside of the study of ecosystems? Is it something that everybody should be thinking about? Social scientists, historians, folks in the humanities. And I strongly believe that there is such a thing as an ecological way of thinking. And ecologists are, not all, but many are especially creative in using ecological ways of thinking to gain a tremendous insight. And the basics of it are that ecosystems are a very complex system, but so are all the other systems that surround us and that we deal with, like economic systems. And the thing about ecology is that it treats this complex system in a way that tries as hard as possible to be cognizant of the tremendous interconnectivity, the feedbacks within the system, the issues of scale. Scale and feedback and connectivity are sort of keywords in any half-decent ecological study. And ecologists, for example, have slowly getting away from this idea that we should think in terms of very simple causality. A causes B, B causes C. In a complex system, everything is connected and it's very difficult to isolate single causes. This emphasis on connectivity and feedback and scale is something that's sadly neglected in a lot of other fields where it shouldn't be. If you look in journals on demography, most demographers never talk about scale. It's as if the population dynamics is a scale-free entity, like a fractal, and it's not. That's why I said in the piece I sent around that some of you may have read that if I had my druthers and I was designing a university, I would require that everybody graduating from the law school, the business school, the economics department, so on, have a good solid course in ecology in which these connections are brought out. It's, I think, a part of the problem that we have in the world today, that we train people who become secretaries of the Treasury or other big influential jobs, heads of corporations, and they have no idea how the world really works. The world that supplies them with water and food, clean air, and other goods and services. That kind of thinking is absent, and it's part of the problem. The first part of the question that you asked about career and shifting from physics, when I was a kid, I was as far from being a geeky math kid as you can get. I was, the kids in my elementary school called me nature boy because I was always out bird watching and collecting soil and rocks and pressing leaves and doing all kinds of things that, and my teachers assumed I had absolutely no talent in math or physics, and that, maybe he'd be a good forest ranger. And in fact, that's what I wanted to be when I was in junior high school. They kept telling me to be an engineer after they realized I was good in math, and that sounded kind of neat. And then I discovered that being an engineer didn't mean that you got to drive locomotives. So that was, I nixed that idea. And then I went to, ended up going into theoretical physics, but very quickly after I got my degree, realized that ecology was much more fun, much more interesting. And so I kind of reverted back to my earliest childhood interests when I switched back from physics to ecology. And you mentioned theoretical ecology. That's something I've mostly taken up in my dotage, because when I was younger, I was doing much more field work, as you know, in Colorado and elsewhere. And the nice thing about doing theory is you don't require huge grants, and I don't have to be able to climb up to 14,000 feet to study sites to do it. So that's kind of why I do what I do now. Also, I enjoy it.
Oh, did we just, oh. My connection froze for a minute. I was just going to say, John, that even though you might not climb up to 14,000 feet as frequently, you can still walk faster than I can at 10,000 feet.
So John and Lara, there are some questions that have come in through the chat, and I think it might be interesting if you pick a couple of them. Susan has a question, Seth has a question, I have one, but you should take mine last.
Okay. Maybe John, we can just follow up on with Susan's question, which is what makes you think that true democracy, that is majority rule with minority rights, would lead to positive synergies? I think this is a reflection on the piece, maybe.
Yeah, it's Susan, that's a very thoughtful question. And true democracy doesn't inevitably lead to anything. But it would, in my opinion, lead to better outcomes than the kind of skewed democracy or semi-democracy that we have now, in which we have this weirdness of the US Senate, which underrepresents more than half the people in the country, the Electoral College, and all the other impediments to democracy that are kind of built into our archaic constitution. Replacing those with a truer democracy would not necessarily lead to better environmental outcomes, but I think it provides a vehicle through which at least the distribution of positives and negatives more closely balanced, and in which people can make wiser decisions that better reflect the social welfare. So I don't want to argue that it's inevitable that a perfect democracy would lead to a perfect society. I'm sure that would not be defensible.
I think the founding fathers had similar doubts.
Yeah, but for different reasons, I think. There was almost an obsession with protecting the rights of minorities. And at the time, the damage that did, by minorities, I mean, if in a true democracy, the fraction of the true democratic public that represented a minority of voices.
And you're going to stay there, there's room?
And reflecting that, there was a good reason to do it at the time. They probably couldn't have gotten the Constitution approved if compromises like that weren't made. But today, this has led to outcomes that are pretty pernicious, like the composition of the Senate and the Electoral College, and the disenfranchisement of so many people.
I think that Neo might have wanted to get in.
He looked like it. He was smart.
Yeah, I was going to say, in some ways, like, in ecosystems, extinctions are kind of democracy in a way where a majority rules and a minority gets wiped out. So it's interesting to think about how that's maybe not always the best metaphor for what we want to have happen ecologically. Neo, why don't you jump in here? And Lara, there's a question for you too that begins to draw part of the cross-generational comparison that I was hoping we'd have a little bit in this chat too. So if Neo can make his comment, and then you can take that question.
Cool, thanks so much. One thing, just on the ecology thing, it's fascinating fascinating that now we have how psychology has ecological theories of psychology. It's all about who you interact with and that sort of thing. Businesses talk about ecosystems. That ecological thinking has clearly expanded, often, as John says, without any formal training in ecology. So that's just to say John's suggestion is awesome. But the other thing I wanted to comment about was democracy. And right now, given what we just went through with Trump and what the pandemic illustrated with China, that their ability to nail it and like incredible competence where we expressed the opposite really makes, I mean, it doesn't make our form of democracy look very good. It looks like China's form of authoritarianism look pretty awesome in comparison. And I'd love to do the numbers as 102 might do, is okay, how many people are, is China putting in prisons versus what we're putting in prisons, in the minority rights, of course, and the issues. I can't, it's not clear to me that we're any better with minority rights than they are. So that's all to say that democracy might really be a bad way to go in terms of dealing with large scale problems of the sort that we've got to deal with.
Let me make just two quick comments. One, we don't really know what the consequences of COVID-19 have been in China. There are estimates that the numbers of infected and dead people is way, way, way higher than we are told. Secondly, there are countries like New Zealand that have done splendidly within a democratic system. And I know there are huge differences between New Zealand and China otherwise, population density for one, but nevertheless, I don't think that that's an argument for totalitarian government.
So maybe I'll jump in, and Seth had posted a question in the chat about the way, or the emphasis on acid rain and ozone issues in 102 and their salience today, and how much they're still taught. And I mean, I guess one thing that the acid rain problem is really useful for is, I would say, bringing in the kind of a chemistry understanding and environmental chemistry understanding. I think one challenge that a lot of us face is that we'll learn something like chemistry in high school or freshman year in college, but it won't have any direct relevance to the things that we care about. Putting the chemical principles that we maybe learned once at one time into a very particular environmental context, I think is a really powerful way for making chemistry relevant to students who are motivated by environmental problems. And so even though in the US, at least, acid rain, is a problem that we think we sort of have in hand in terms of the kinds of regulations that we've put in place, it's still a big problem globally, first of all. But second of all, I think it sort of allows students to see the relevance of some of those foundational concepts in environmental science. So I've continued to keep the chemistry dimension of the course in place. I think for that reason. I also, for stratospheric ozone, there's this sort of interesting link to the climate problem, in that our only climate treaty is the Montreal Protocol. It's the only the only greenhouse gases that are internationally regulated by treaty are the greenhouse gases that are regulated in the Montreal Protocol, which is, it's kind of interesting. And so I have one lecture on stratospheric ozone. So I don't know how many lectures did you have in the 1980s on the ozone?
Just one on ozone, but I want to just point out that that rather challenging 102 lecture on alkalinity and buffering that most of those of you who took the course remember is exactly what you needed to know in order to understand ocean acidification,
Yes.
which is part of the climate problem.
Yes, and we do
But we
cover
would
that.
have
And I
had to
know,
do it anyway.
yeah,
And that's the thing about the tools you learn in 102 are extendable to other systems. When you understand the very basics of the chemistry and the physics and the ecology and biology of environmental science, you find that you can bring them to bear on new problems as well.
So
Yeah.
I'd like to insert a question for the two of you as well, that's based a bit in John's article. If that's, did I cut in before you finished, Lara?
no, go ahead.
So John, part of your article calls for a rationality with respect to science. And he's not here, but I hear Jean always saying rational with respect to what? And I wondered if you two could both reflect over the last 2 years of being climate researchers and talk a little bit about whether the way you do climate research now and the way you think about it has shifted as the social context for how climate research is received has shifted. Like, do you have to be differently rational with respect to the policy community? Do you have to be differently rational with respect to the types of people you're planning to engage through that research and the way that you're trying to send a message?
You want to go first, Lara?
I mean, I guess one thing that's been, I guess, somewhat gratifying, I would say, is that there are a broader range of customers for the information that we're trying to generate in my research, at least, the kind of understanding that I'm pursuing. I think, I mean, I guess I got my PhD in 2003, so less than 20 years ago, but still, a long time ago. And at the time, I decided I wanted to do a postdoc in regional climate modeling because I felt like the global climate models were producing information that was kind of irrelevant to policymakers who needed to understand what was going to happen, at the scale of a state or a county or, something far more local than the global climate models could produce. And so I did that. I learned about climate modeling at the regional scale. And, that sort of contributed to one kind of avenue of my work since then. But at the time, there really wasn't, there was a little bit in terms of, kind of regional climate downscaling and people trying to do impacts, but there wasn't a full appreciation for how, say the decisions we make about how we manage our land or, how much we do afforestation or reforestation will affect local climate and water resources and all these connections that John was talking about. Now, this is what the state wants. In effect, the state of California is sort of casting about for what kind of modeling system they should have to try and project some of these kind of multidimensional impacts of decisions that they might take in terms of fostering forest management to mitigate wildfires, or how wildfires could impact smoke and how we forecast what the impacts of that management are on the exposure of people to smoke, and how we could avoid other kinds of wildfires by doing prescribed burn. So there's just sort of, been a huge increase, I would say, in the demand for the kind of sort of integrated understanding that we have of climate science and ecosystem science and the interaction between the two. So I would say that's been really gratifying and kind of fun, actually, to be there.
Great answer. Not sure I can add anything. I know this concept of rationality can raise eyebrows and cause dissent and annoyance in people. To me, what is the essence of rationality, as we use it when we talk about doing science, is that we have procedures that allow us to discard ideas that don't work. We have, that's what science is about. It's about killing your own or other people's suggestions and hypotheses and theories. And when we deal with climate deniers, which I deal with a lot, what I've learned is that you have to tackle the myths that they propound, the myth like that the sun is the cause of global warming, or the idea that increasing CO2 will simply mean that we'll have bigger agricultural harvests because CO2 is a food nutrient. Those ideas can be debunked with very clear, fact-based, logical arguments. And I find that making those arguments is often one of the best ways to approach deniers. If you try to tell them that, you know, if you keep believing that you're going to drown in the next hurricane or burn up in the next wildfire, it doesn't work. But you really have to go directly to the myths, and a rational response to the irrationality of these myths that climate deniers propose, I find it often is effective. It's you have to sort of hone the arguments, and you learn by trial and error how to do it. But I think that's when I talk about rationality, that's kind of what I'm referring to.
I'm not sure that I'm missing a question in the chat so far, but I'm curious whether people have comments they can share back with John and Lara now in response to some of the ideas they've shared with us. Does anybody feel comfortable offering anything? I'm hoping the answer is yes. So.
I can pose a question, and
please.
And I'm helping Lara teach one of the sessions this year for two sections actually.
Good.
So yeah, I've been definitely learning a lot. It's my first time teaching, so thank you, Lara, for all your help. And something that I have always been interested in, I think it was one of the things that brought me to ERG, and I think my question is, if you guys think there is a space in 102 for that, is how to evaluate new technologies and their impact. So like there's a lot of talks about, oh, this is like the new panacea, this is the new way of solving the climate, and some of the students ask questions like this. So I wonder, like, what would be the best way to incorporate that into the current curriculum?
Yeah, I think about that with geoengineering, actually. We don't really talk about geoengineering, but we talk about particulates and energy balance, and we talk about CO2 and ocean acidification. And so it seems like maybe there would be, that would be an example of a technology, for example, for climate that would solve one dimension of a problem, but not another. And it might be interesting to sort of think about that issue, that you're bringing up is, how do you evaluate a new technology? One might be able to introduce some of those kinds of examples of technologies and the different pieces that you might need to bring together to think about them in terms of, how they might be effective in one dimension, but not in another dimension, or something like that.
I used to assign a homework problem on what would be the consequences of deriving all of our current energy needs from biofuels. And the answer is astounding. I mean, when you work through that homework problem, you will probably never again say biofuels is the answer to the energy dilemma. but I think, you know, you can pick sort of, you can't go into all the nitty gritty of every proposed technology, but for some of them, you can come up with pretty nifty little homework problems that provide a good deal of insight.
Yeah, I'd be interested. We've got a minute left. I'm a little provoked by that, as well as the comments that have just been made about things that I know I'm engaged with, where like California is trying to advance the system of statewide composting. Done one way, it could be quite helpful, and done another way, it maybe couldn't be. So that would be an interesting question. And things like biochar come out of that conversation. Well, how much reduction do you really get out of biochar based on what we know, if you're really trying to think of that as a solution on a statewide basis? So I think those are topical things that would be cool to put in one or two. And I guess I'll go one step farther and say, Lara, if you haven't already thought about those things and you think in any way it could be helpful, I'd be happy to do so.
You can write a question for the exam.
Yeah. Does anybody else have other thoughts for John and Lara before we go? I realize we ended our last panel a bit quickly, and I'm not sure we got a chance to thank the panelists. So I want to make sure that people have a chance to thank the two of you, as well as offer any final thoughts in the remaining 30 seconds.
And thank you, Chad, for spurring us to have this conversation.
And for organizing it in the first place.
Yes.
You're welcome. Sorry, that was not a ploy to be thanked. That was a ploy to thank you guys. So thank you for making the time to come and do this. And thank you all for listening and being part of the conversation by being engaged listeners. So even if you're not speaking, I realize that's only part of participation. All right, well, with that, I will see you back in the other room.
Good.
Everyone.